humans make some very strange decisions, including making videos about the strange decisions that humans make, like this video. So when we think about human nature, there might be lots of things we are thinking about: our upright gait, our famous opposable thumbs, the fact that we're sort of naked, don't have fur, at least largely not, and our long infancy, where we're highly dependent on our parents. But one of the things that I think deserves a really special look as part of the investigation of human nature is our distinctively human ways of thinking, uniquely human cognition. I think there are two reasons why it is important to think about distinctively human cognition. First, it's sort of philosophically important. What is philosophy all about? Well, on a broad reading of philosophy, what philosophers worry about is sort of what our place is in the universe. Philosophers worry about how all these different things that make up the universe, this causal nexus that builds up the universe, how all of these different things hang together, and then where humans slot into this big giant nexus of causes. Now here, thinking about human cognition is important because the way we think impacts the way we act, and therefore impacts the sort of impact we have on the rest of the universe. And so by having a better understanding of human cognition, we have a better understanding of how humans navigate their environment, and therefore we have a better understanding of how humans fit into the universe. So that's interesting philosophically. But it's also interesting from the point of view of sort of social science. By a better understanding, through a better understanding of distinctively human cognition, we're put in a better place to predict and explain how humans make decisions, how they navigate the environment. And that's helpful because it can enable us to build better institutions that improve life on this planet for us and all other humans, and in fact for other living things on the planet, for the planet as a whole. So by thinking about distinctively human cognition, we're put in a position to build social institutions, trading institutions that help us deal with climate change, that help us improve access to healthcare, that help us lessen inequalities, that help us reduce strife and war, that help us in our conservation effort and make life better for other living things on the planet, and in fact make sort of the way the planet works better. And so I think thinking about distinctively human cognition is really important. Now it turns out characterizing distinctively human cognition and then explaining why humans think in these ways turns out to be quite tricky. But what I want to do here is point out that there are three things that any investigation into distinctively human cognition should pay attention to before we even get started on thinking about exactly how to characterize distinctively human cognition and how to explain it. Here are sort of three methodological constraints or principles that is, I think, important to keep in mind as we engage in these kind of inquiries. And the first is that the focus of an inquiry into distinctively human cognition should be on the cognition part more than the behavioral part. Now, as I just mentioned, obviously cognition influences behavior. Behavior is very important in this investigation because the way we act can be used as evidence or data for thinking about the kind of cognitive structures that gave rise to that action, for sure. But what we're primarily interested in when we're thinking about distinctively human cognition is to think about the cognitive structures that give rise to the action. And that's because sometimes, one of the main reasons that sometimes very different cognitive structures can actually lead to the same kinds of behaviors. And if we just focus on the behavior, we might lose track of these different psychological structures. So someone might buy a new electric car because they want to display their wealth. Someone else might want to buy a new electric car because they think it contributes to a better environment for their offspring. They want to move away from the sort of environmental problems that come with traditional cars, and someone else might buy a new electric car for the aesthetic values embodied in that car. The important thing is if we focus on just the car buying behavior, we're losing sight of the fact that there are actually very different motivations at stake here, and we're losing sight of the fact that humans, in fact, are motivated in these very different ways. Aesthetic value, moral considerations, or sort of broadly speaking, wealth or egoistic sort of economic considerations. These are all things that impact how we evaluate our environment, and in this particular context, they lead to the same behavior. But in different contexts, they can lead to different behaviors. And so, if we don't pay attention to these psychological structures, we sort of losing sight of this particular phenomenon. The second thing I want to point out is that an investigation of distinctively human cognition shouldn't be equated with an investigation into forms of cognition that are shared by all humans. There are some ways of thinking that all humans might have in common, perhaps, but then there are also things that only some humans do some of the time, but that are still sort of important from the point of view of distinctively human cognition. One of those might be, for example, the fact that humans have a disposition, in some circumstances, to express their thoughts in a written manner. We can learn to communicate with others by writing down our thoughts, not just writing them down in any old way, but writing them down in a way that's productive and systematic. We've developed specially engineered codes that are productive and systematic, and that therefore mimic some of the features that natural languages have. That's really useful because now we can express effectively an open-ended range of thoughts and communicate those to other people. Now, that's really special. No non-human living thing on this planet is literate. Only humans are literate. But importantly, very few humans, if we're looking at humanity as a whole, are actually literate. That came pretty late in human history, and certainly many humans just are not literate. So it's not the case that all humans are literate, but it's still an important thing to think about when we think about distinctively human cognition. And the third thing that I want to point out is that when we want to think about distinctively human cognition, we shouldn't be thinking about or looking for things that are off the charts different compared to what we find in non-human animals. So, for example, some non-human animals seem to engage in or seem to make decisions based on some proto-moral considerations. Chimpanzees, for example, can evaluate the fairness of outcomes. So they may engage in a task, and depending on whether the reward they've received for that task is fair compared to the reward that other chimps have gotten, influences how they react to receiving that reward. So there's some kind of proto-moral evaluation going on in the chimps, so it seems. Does that mean that moral thought is not distinctively human? I don't think so. I think it means that some ways of thinking in moral terms might not be distinctively human, but there might still be other ways of thinking in moral terms that are distinctively human. So maybe humans think more frequently in moral terms, or they employ moral concepts that are more complex or more abstract, or that have other features that are different from the kind of moral concepts employed by non-human animals. The upshot of this is that even though the difference between human moral cognition and non-human moral cognition may be more of a difference in degree, not a difference in kind, that doesn't mean it's not a significant difference. I think that's important to keep in mind because it's plausible, in fact, I believe it's very likely that virtually all forms of human cognition will find some kind of bases or some similarities in non-human forms of cognition. Does that mean there's no significant difference between human cognition and non-human cognition? No, it does not, because differences of degree can still be very significant. If you imagine a dial, like on a guitar amplifier, you can change how your guitar sounds by increasing the gain on the amp, or changing the treble or the bass setting on your amp. You get a very different sound at the other end. these are just differences in degree, more base, less base. But the resulting difference can be great. The same is true for human cognition. These might be differences in degree, but they're still significant. I think keeping these three constraints in mind will set us up well for any investigation into distinctively human cognition.